Hi there. I'm happy to be with you. We're happy to be invited to explain about deaf ministry. My name is Carol Stevens. I'm a certified lay minister of the United Methodist Church, and I coordinate deaf ministry here. I brought with me two other people. This is a deaf woman by the name of Karen Miller. She is deaf, and she's the first certified lay minister. She does lots of deaf ministry work here. And the other person, this is Chloe Merchant. She's hearing, and she's the director, one of the directors for the deaf camp for people with special needs. She'll explain that later. Thank you. I would like to explain some things about deaf people first. All of us now are becoming more sensitive about how other people's attitudes are about themselves. Most of us have our views about people, but what is their view about themselves? The same is true about deaf people. Hearing people, we have our view about deaf people. But deaf people have a different view about themselves. You will see what I mean. Hearing people, like us, think of deaf people as handicapped, or that there's something wrong with their ears. Prior to my starting to work with deaf people 50 years ago, I felt the same way as you. I had a hearing perspective, but deaf people have taught me a lot. Hearing people think that deaf people would like to become a hearing person, and that would be a wonderful thing, to fix deaf people, to be a hearing person. But some people think that deaf people and hearing people, the only difference is that deaf people's ears don't work, but it's more complicated than that. Deaf people feel differently about themselves. They don't feel handicapped. They feel they have a different identity, that they're a minority group. They don't use the labels handicapped or disabled. Also, they have different ways of relating to each other. Different language, different culture, different ways to raise their children, different values, different social mores in the deaf community. Do deaf people want to become a hearing person? No. Deaf people who have grown up deaf most of their lives don't want to be a hearing person. That's their identity. They're deaf, and that's fine. Now, deaf kids are born to hearing parents. A woman's pregnant, she gives birth to the baby, she looks at the baby, it looks fine. They don't expect to be having a deaf baby. They haven't had contact with deaf people before. So 90% of deaf kids have hearing parents. And do hearing parents learn sign language to be able to communicate with their children? No. 90% of hearing parents never are able to communicate with their child in sign language more than just a few gestures and a few signs to communicate. Doctors, parents take their children to the doctors and think the doctor knows about deafness, but that's not so. They know how the ear works, but they don't know that deafness is a different culture, different language, development, psychology. And deaf people really don't know anything about deaf people and their culture. Hearing parents want to have their child fixed and become a hearing child. When you go to the doctor, you want the doctor to fix you and make you well. Well, it's the same kind of a thing. Hearing parents want their deaf child fixed to become a hearing child. I want to show you this picture. This artist is a deaf woman, and she shows a hearing supremacy attitude towards deaf people. This hearing attitude that people have is shown on the far side. It's an attitude that the artist is drawing. See, the face is all angry, hands pressing the head of the deaf person and wrapped around the head. The picture here closer, a smiling face, gentle hands around the head. There's signing in colors inside of the head. A hearing attitude looking down like that at deaf people we think of as hearing privilege. That means the hearing people, we think it's easy when we go to see a doctor to communicate, or when we call the police. Do you expect to have a problem communicating to the doctor's office or police? No problem. No problem to communicate. Or suppose you're applying for a job. You expect to be able to communicate okay, but for a deaf person, contacting with the police, for example, with a problem with the neighbor next door, The deaf person calls the police, but the police don't talk to the deaf person, they talk to the hearing person. And who gets arrested? The deaf person gets arrested. So deaf people are very reticent about the communication issues they have. You don't expect to be discriminated against because of problems in communicating. One small example about this is employment. Here in America, 72% of hearing people work in America. But with deaf people, only 42%, much lower percent. It's not because they don't want to work. It's not because they're not skilled enough to work. It's because they're not offered the opportunities to work because of hearing privilege, feeling that deaf people cannot do it. Being deaf doesn't make you dumb. The same as being hearing doesn't make you smart. People wonder, what do I call this person? Deaf and dumb? No. Deaf and mute? No. Hearing impaired? No. But deaf people don't feel like there's something wrong with their ears, that they're impaired. So not dumb. Just call a person deaf or hard of hearing. Let's talk about church. We're all church people, right? Well, in America, 42% of hearing people go to church at least once a month. Pretty good. But deaf people is quite different. Only 1 to 2% of hearing people ever go to church, except for a funeral or a wedding. Deaf people don't go to church. They've had bad experiences in church. They don't want to go to church. If, like this child in the picture, they were dragged to church, a hearing church, no interpreter, no Sunday school, no learning, it's boring, it's a drag. They don't want to go to church. Or maybe they were dragged up to the front of the church and somebody laid hands on them and shook their head and tried to direct their head off of their shoulders, and they wondered what's going on. Somebody was trying to heal them to become a hearing person. They're traumatized. What are they trying to do to me? So deaf people don't want to go to church. So maybe you think you want to set up deaf ministry. You bring in an interpreter, you pay them good money, you set them a ministry, but deaf people don't come. Deaf people have bad experiences in church. They do not want to go to church. Here in Pendle, we have 3,000 sign language using deaf people. That's a lot of people. I want to explain to you some about deaf ministry. This is done through your apportionment money. Your apportionment money helps to pay to support for deaf ministry. And we thank God for this conference for the support that we get. The money is not used to pay for staff. We're all volunteers. But the money is used for programming, things that we need to do to be able to carry out deaf ministry. So we thank you for your good gifts through your apportionment. Now I'd like to talk about some fun things about deaf ministry to show you what's been happening here in deaf ministry. We've talked a little bit about interpreting services, and we have some churches that do have interpreted church services. Here's one example of a traditional church service, which most of you would be familiar with, something like this, for deaf ministry. There's an interpreter for a traditional church service who interprets and follows everything, and the deaf people sit and watch like spectators about what's happening. They're not involved in the worship, but they're watching while the interpreter is interpreting the music, the prayers, the preaching. Now here is another example. This is a church. This is St. Paul's in Odessa. They have an interpreter for their contemporary church service every Sunday. People come to the church and watch the service. They are involved in the singing, but mostly they sit and watch what's going on and not involved in what's going on in worship otherwise. Now this woman is an interpreter also at Wyoming United Methodist Church. Every Sunday, she does 2 church services. At that church, they also have one person who uses this. Now this might be very helpful for you in your hearing church when you have hard of hearing people or people whose hearing is declining and they don't know sign language. This is a free app that you can use on your phone. And everything that's spoken, you can read on the phone. You can sit there and read what's happening. It's wonderful for church services and meetings, all kinds of things. And it's free. We also have one church that has a drive-through or a drive-in church service. At this church, the interpreter sits outside, as you can see, on a chair, and the deaf person sits inside in their car and watches the interpreter. This is at Mount Hope in the Seaford Charge. Next is the church Epworth in Rehoboth Beach in Delaware. You can see this is a different picture. The large picture has the interpreter and it's easy for the deaf people to see, and the small insert is of the church service and the pastor. It's much easier to see the hands because they're enlarged. Now I'd like to introduce to you Karen Miller to talk about deaf worship. It's different than hearing worship. In hearing worship, people sit back and watch the worship going on, but in deaf worship, it's quite different. We have a deaf church service at Grace Church in Wilmington, Delaware. And I preach. I'm the deaf pastor, and everything is done in sign language. The scripture, the music is done by deaf people. There's experiments shown, and people are sharing, and drama. Here's a person who's acting out the drama, what it means about the helmet, and the shield, and the sword, and shows things. So it's much more experiential. This is from Texas, a Methodist church for the deaf in Texas, and this is a woman who's deaf who is leading the singing. Now, she is a certified CLS, certified lay servant. She's become a lay servant for the deaf. Carol Stevens and I developed the curriculum for the certified lay servant course. This is a hard of hearing pastor from that same church in Texas. Other people from all over the world, from other countries, can watch the church service. From Africa, many different countries, and all over the U.S. We also have Bible studies. Since COVID, we thought, what are we going to do? There's no church. People are getting really despondent. So the idea came up for Zoom Bible studies. So people can join every Monday, Friday, and Saturday for Bible studies. There's lots of fellowship, prayer, Bible studies together. We've been doing this during the COVID time. Deaf community outreach. For domestic violence, we had one woman who was struggling to try to get her help, and there was no help at all for her in Delaware, no services for domestic violence. So we had to fly her to Washington State, where they have therapy for deaf people and counseling, and deaf people from all over the country come there to this home to support each other and get counseling. Now, I mentored this girl from Delaware School for the Deaf since she was 5, and now she's almost 17 years old. I would visit the school once a week and do various things with her. She's involved in church, and now here's her Sweet 16 picture at this time. She will be graduating this spring. She's expecting to go to college and to become a lawyer. Pastoral care at the hospital. I am certified to go to hospitals, to visit in hospitals, nursing homes, visit people at home with their families. I had one person that's kind of a funny story. I went to visit him at the hospital. He was lying there in bed, and they said he was in a coma. I looked at him and thought, nobody's touched him, nobody's had contact with him. So I went up to him, I started signing to his hands, and he jerked. I did it again, and he could feel me. I said, oh, so I got enthusiastic about it. Here he'd been left all this time for 2 weeks, so I decided to be a little mischievous. I pried his eyes open, got his eyes open, and he woke up. And the nurse came and said, how did you do this? I was feeling kind of guilty, so I didn't want to explain. The daughter came in later on, and I said, who is this with an H? He used this sign. And she said, oh, that was a member of the family. So I had to tell people, just because a person is lying there, go and touch their body, make contact with them. They can't hear you, but they can feel you. This is a deaf-blind woman, my friend. Her name is Susie. We went to Deaf Independent Living Association. They have many opportunities for deaf-blind people, and these are 2 deaf-blind people communicating with each other. I also go to her dentist's office with her and communicate with her in tactile sign language. And this is a picture of the 2 of us at Grace Church distributing food during the Corona time. Both of us were working together. She's deaf-blind and I'm deaf, and so we were able to distribute food together. We also take her around for trips for having some fun. Here she is riding horses. She loves that. Deaf-blind. Every month, we have a deaf luncheon where people can get together, mostly senior citizens. For the last 9 years, we've had a Deaf Tax Day. With interpreter program students coming, people are learning to become interpreters, mentored with certified interpreters. And then deaf people have their taxes done for free. ARP has been quite willing to provide us free people to do the Deaf Tax Day. It's been very successful. Our Deaf Expo was held at Grace Church. Oh, it was so good, so much fun, so much interaction. This is before COVID. Over 300 people flocked to this. It was very successful. We had different people, organizations, Delaware School for the Deaf, mainstream programs, different churches, interpreters, everybody involved in this. We also have a Black History Month. This woman took over this, and she's explaining about Andrew Foster, who was the first graduate who was African American from Gallaudet University and set up deaf schools in Africa. We also hired a dancer from who goes to the United Methodist Church, and the drummers are also United Methodist people, and she taught us dancing. Oh, it was wonderful. Lots of noise and fun. Now, advocacy. You can see that lots of deaf ministry is not done in the church, but outside in the community. In fact, most deaf ministry is done out in the community with the people. One big advocacy that we're involved in is the provision of services for deaf people in Delaware and in Maryland. A huge issue in Delaware has been a complete lack of deaf group homes. We have been struggling and struggling for over 11 years through the Methodist Church as leaders to try to get the state to provide group homes for deaf people. Maryland has them, Pennsylvania has them, New Jersey has them. Delaware has nothing that's appropriate. Delaware people, if they're in group homes, there's a hearing group home with one deaf person and there's no communication. A deaf person in another group home, no communication. Deaf person in a different group home, no communication. Each one isolated. Why not put them all together? Have them be able to socialize with each other, with staff. Deaf staff or hearing staff that's sign fluent, so they can make like a family, so they can be able to communicate with each other. This has been a real struggle. Maybe you wonder how you could be helping in deaf ministry. Maybe you could help if you knew how to work with politicians to get them involved to helping this to be successful in this struggle. But also, there are many, many services that we do not have. In Delaware, for example, there is no therapy, no counseling, nothing for people who have emotional or mental health issues. There's nothing for deaf people that has deaf communication. Go hire in an interpreter, the next week there'll be a different interpreter. So there's no consistency, so therapy does not really happen. This is a huge need. There are very few services at all in Delaware. So this requires lots of advocacy, and that's where deaf ministry happens, out in the community. Now I'd like to ask Clelly to talk about a really great camp. I want to discuss Deaf Camp Signs and Wonders. Here's what that's about. Every year, for 1 week, we have a camp for deaf adults who have additional disabilities. We call them Deaf Plus. The camp occurs at Camp Pacomet. They host us every year. It's so enjoyable. A great week of fun with many, many activities. There's swimming, games, friends and fellowship, and the boat. Oh, that's a favorite activity, the boat. What's the purpose of camp? To give a person from a group home, or who might be living at home with their family, as Carol had said, they're isolated, and to give them a week full of activities, interesting, exciting, fellowship, meeting new friends. So this is really our goal, to give the person the best week of their whole year. Now, how could your church be involved? Well, it's pretty easy. If you wanted, you could give a donation of money to sponsor a camper to come to camp, $450. That's it, for the person to have the best week of their whole year. Or maybe you could think about this. What gifts do you have? Do you like to fish? Do you know how to fish? We haven't a clue. But if you know how to fish, we have people who come to camp who want to fish. You could come to Camp Pacomet 1 or 2 days in the morning during that week and give them a wonderful experience. Think about the skills that you have. For example, the boat, The man who comes, he comes every year and he volunteers. He comes for free and he brings his boat, and that is the favorite activity. Everybody says, boat, 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 boat. And I say, yes, yes, boat. Can he sign? Does he understand deaf people? No, but he has a willing heart. So think about that for yourself. You also heard Carol talking about Delaware group homes and how terrible the situation is. There's so much isolation. All of these guys live in group homes in Delaware, one in each home. So Carol thought, let's make a group for them. So every month they get together and have a social group. Now this is before COVID. We had these monthly events and people could socialize together. The goal of this was to reduce the isolation and improve their mental health, and it's quite successful. Maybe your church could be involved in something like that. For example, Skyline United Methodist Church in Wilmington asked us, we're interested in how we could help you. What do you need? So we said, well, there's a birthday coming up soon. Would you like to have a party? They said, fine. They bought the cake, they bought gifts, they showed up, and we all celebrated the birthday. It was really such a special birthday for this guy. Skyline's not a deaf church. They don't have deaf ministry, no deaf members, but they have a heart. So be interested and think of how you could open your mind to think how you could be involved. Here's another guy smiling. This is a guy who never smiles, but he was so happy for his birthday. And the third one we want to show you is this. Think about ways that you could show up. What are specific resources and things that you could maybe be involved with deaf ministry? Keep your heart and mind open. We also are involved on a national level with deaf Methodist groups and events. There's the United Methodist Congress of the Deaf. This is a grassroots organization with different deaf ministries all over the U.S. that all get together and support each other. This is the Northeast Jurisdictional Group for Deaf Ministry. At that meeting, we taught the Certified Lay Servant class that Karen was talking about before. This is the first time that deaf people have the opportunity to get any kind of training through the Methodist Church to become leaders. Prior to that, there was nothing. Deaf people had no opportunities like that. So we have established this, and 22 people have already completed the training to become certified lay servants. Also, the United Methodist Church, the general church level, there's the United Methodist Deaf and Hard of Hearing Ministries. I'm vice president of that right now. They get money through the general church to provide grants to churches that want to do something different in developing some kind of deaf ministry. Because deaf ministry is not very well supported in the Methodist Church throughout the country, and also this is true of the Episcopal and the Lutheran deaf ministries. The three denominations decided when we met together that we would support each other. None of us have much money or much support, but we know what our needs are. We know how to support each other. So we have developed resources. We go on mission trips together. We have meetings and support each other. All different kinds of things that show up and different needs. We also go on mission trips. This is a mission trip in the U.S. There were 40 people, some deaf, Lutherans, and Methodists, 40 people all together who went to Redbird. Many of you know about Redbird. People's houses get renovated and improved in the Kentucky area. This is a picture of one house. See this little boy in the corner here in a wheelchair? Before, his family had to pick him up and carry him into the house. But as he got bigger and bigger, they were unable to pick him up. So one of the teams went to his house and renovated the house and built a ramp so he could roll into the house. Here's another house. You can see the huge holes in the floor. And people went there, this group. They have wonderful, deaf, skilled carpenters. They were great. And they were the leaders of the team to renovate this house. And it was a lot of work. This picture down here, those are all the people who worked on this house who fell through the hole in the floor. All of them went through the hole. So they need to have a special picture. Now these men, this man here is from Rehoboth Beach Church. And this is his friend who is from Virginia. Both of them are deaf. They were leaders. Without the deaf leaders as carpenters, we hearing people were stuck. We had no skills. But the deaf people were wonderful leaders. Also, we do international mission trips to Africa. Here we were planning to go to Africa, see these heavy suitcases all stuffed with things that people from various churches, possibly your church, gave to us to take there to Africa. Books, school supplies, various things that they tell us that they need. We don't decide what to bring. We ask them what do they need. We've been there for 14 times, so we have developed a great friendship and partnership. So they have told us what they want, and we take what they want. We don't make those decisions ourselves. And like we don't build houses, we don't have any construction site experience. But we do have experience with deaf ministry and deaf empowerment and deaf culture. And that's what we do. One of the places where we work is in Meru, Kenya. The first time that I went there with Bishop Peggy Johnson, we met this woman. She came up to us and she said to Bishop Peggy, "God is calling me to become a pastor." Bishop Peggy and I looked at each other, and Peggy talked with her. And she said, "Yep, this is for real." She wants to become, and God's calling her to become a pastor. So Bishop Peggy supported her, advocated with her for the Methodist Church of Kenya bishop. And we supported her through seminary and her family, and now she's fully ordained and she does deaf ministry for the Methodist Church of Kenya throughout that country. This other picture is other people on the team who are working in the schools, teaching, modeling good deaf education for the teachers. The hearing teachers in the schools really have no training in how to teach deaf children. Now this is a really neat place. When we first arrived in Kenya in 1997, we went and saw this place, and there were 4 little deaf children sitting in a room, just sitting there. There was no sign language. There was nothing happening. They just sat all day, day after day after day. Well, the next year, when I came back, I talked to the head person at the school and I said, "Is there a deaf person around that we could have come and teach sign language to the deaf kids?" He said, "Oh, I never thought about a deaf person. Deaf person are so disregarded and so unimportant in their culture." So a deaf person came. We supported her financially for 3 years, and now those 3 or 4 kids, that school has increased to 180 kids. Before, they weren't even ranked as a deaf school in Kenya. Now, the 32 deaf schools in Kenya, this school has raised up to being 3rd ranked as the 3rd best school for deaf children in Kenya. It's neat. It's very far out in the country. We also do work in Zimbabwe. There's a preschool for deaf children there that's a wonderful place. It's the only deaf preschool in Zimbabwe. It's located in a very, very poor area of Zimbabwe, but it's a wonderful place with wonderful people and a wonderful program. The children start, and when it's time to go to regular school, they want to keep staying in the preschool. Connected with that school is an income-generating project, a place where young deaf people can learn to develop job-related skills. These women are learning how to sew, and now, with COVID, they're making masks, and now they're making visors, and they're selling them and getting some pretty good money. They also are donating lots of masks to the kids in schools. Here is one of the teachers, a deaf woman who teaches in the deaf preschool. She's a wonderful deaf leader. It's important to have deaf people in leadership as role models. Hearing people can also look up at the deaf people. Now this is a group of deaf people in one of the churches. When we first arrived in Zimbabwe, there was no deaf ministry in the Methodist Church at all. Now there are 3 churches that have growing deaf ministries, and this is one of them. These are some of the people, young people, middle-aged people, a diverse group of people in this deaf ministry, which is growing and very active. And the Hearing Church is very accepting of them, empowers them, puts them in positions of leadership, has them as an integral part of the church. They don't sit back as spectators. They're an integral part of the church, and they're encouraged. Now, during the Corona time, we want to teach you something. We have Karen come up and show you something. Passing the peace. How do you do that in church now? You can't hug each other, touch each other. We deaf people have a way to show you. Karen? See my shirt? It says, be kind. During COVID, we're thinking we can't hug each other, we can't shake hands during COVID. What should we do? Well, here's an idea to share with all of your churches. Hearing and deaf, both kinds can use this. We want to teach you, peace be with you, and I love you. It's real simple. You don't have to touch each other. You can see from far away and flash I love you signs to each other, or peace be with you. Peace be with you. It's simple. So please share that with your churches. I love you. Thank you. If you'd like to contact us, here's contact information for Karen and me. Call, text, send us an email. We'll be happy to come to your church or do a Zoom meeting or whatever you would like. Contact us for information, or if you have any questions or needs, please ask us. We are here for you. Thank you so much for inviting us to explain to you about deaf ministry. We hope that you will be involved with us. Maybe you've gotten some ideas that you can adapt to your ministries that you can do and work in your church with hearing people. And this is a way that we can all partner with each other. We love you.